morning, everyone. Welcome to this last lecture for our lecture series, Digital Delights and Disturbances. And it's actually a perfect way to end the semester, this spring 26 semester, by hosting a talk by Jonas Staal. Jonas Staal is a visual artist whose works engages with the relationship between art, democracy, and propaganda. We will see how he works on the redefinition of this idea of propaganda, you know. Usually when we use the word propaganda, it's always, you know, not really a nice word, but actually, and also very conservative, right? But Jonas is working throughout his visual work, is actually trying to redefine a new reality by changing meanings, by imagining other futures, especially in this moment in which we see that it's very, you know, the future in front of us is increasingly becoming unthinkable, unbearable, very dark. You know, we have passing by, living through different crises, wars, genocides, constant crisis, and we are also very tired and exhausted, I guess, because of what is happening. But today, I think Jonas is gonna present us with new ways of thinking about images through a new way of imagining. I really want to emphasize this relationship between image and imagination, which I probably will come back to after the talk, because it's extremely interesting to see also how to push the boundaries of imagination. We live in a culture that it's very visual, hyper-visual, and therefore we are inclined to think that images are imagination, and imagination is all about images. But I do think that Jonas' work through images does show that, in fact, another way of imagining things is possible through images, but not necessarily only exclusively by using images. Again, we do need imagination first, and I think Jonas' work shows this brilliantly. So Jonas has done many exhibitions. I just want to remind a couple of titles: We Demand a Million More Years, Extinction Wars, Propaganda Station, the British East India Company on Trial, and is also the author of a couple of super interesting books that are super timely. One of them is Propaganda Art in the 21st Century, MIT Press 2019, and Climate Propagandas, Stories of Extinction and Regeneration, MIT Press 2024. And without further hesitation, I give the floor to Jonas, and then we'll have a Q&A after the talk. Thank you, Jonas.
Thank you so much, Donatella, for the invitation and for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to take the excuse of a lecture to continue our conversations, much in admiration of your work and research as well. Thank you for coming on a very, very lovely spring evening to listen to a talk with the title "The Death of Elon Musk and Other Stories." Donatella and I were discussing, you know, what does it mean to practice art? What does it mean to engage in cultural work at a time of various intersecting crises? As we face rising authoritarianism, neo-fascism, the rise of trillion-dollar company, extreme forms of precarization of labor through these, you know, techno-feudal infrastructures and forms of excessive power, climate collapse. I think what it means is Donatella has spoken about the Syrian civil war as a kind of laboratory in which various strategies of militarization have been applied. In the length of that, I would say, you know, Palestine would be the outcome. The genocide in Palestine would be the outcome of that laboratory, where what we used to know as governance has been replaced by genocide. I tend to refer to it as genocidalism, to understand genocide not as an event, but as something that fundamentally replaces structures of politics and governance as we knew them. But it's important, I would say, to take on two questions in relationship to to the necessary death of Elon Musk and other stories. And the first relates to the fact that these ruins that we're watching, this replacement of governance by genocidalism, is not something accidental. It's something that has been rehearsed. It's something that is planned. And that brings me from a cultural and artistic perspective to this question: who imagined, scripted, rehearsed, and staged genocidalism? Like, who composed today's ruins? And I am an artist, and I'm also a propaganda researcher. Most of my written or research work is focused on the question, what is the role of artists and cultural workers in shaping political regimes today? What is the role of art in propaganda? Propaganda, in my analysis, essentially is not about sending a message purely. Propaganda is about constructing entirely new realities, manufacturing a new consent. And art and culture plays an essential role in that process, both from a perspective of oppressive regimes, but also from the side of opposition, from democratization movements, from popular uprising. We, people who are invested in progressive politics, we propagate as well. We propagate images, imaginaries of different realities in which radical equality, democratization, redistribution is central. So I don't believe propaganda only belongs to them, the neo-fascist authoritarian class. But I do want to focus now first on this question, who composed, designed, scripted, staged the ruins in which we find ourselves today? A big part of my research focuses on what I call the shadow art world, meaning artists and cultural workers who are directly employed by the military-industrial complex. So we can think of the realm of militainment, the game designers that emerged from the Pentagon, for example. Colonel Wardynski famously designed America's Army, which is a kind of predecessor to Call of Duty. It's this massive multiplayer shooter platform game. It was active for about 15 years, had millions of users, but in order to play it, you could play it for free. You always had to go through the Army's recruitment website. So there was this extreme proximity to an attempt to create a form of culture that was so close to a desired reality. And the games themselves were designed based on actual missions that were taking place at that very moment. It's an attempt to create a culture that is extremely close to the present, but that you can experience in a relatively safe environment, but that already changes or shapes a mentality in which, the step from day-to-day reality to the step into war becomes extremely minimal. It's very telling to think of. It's very telling that this form of militainment was first initiated, developed by the Pentagon directly, but then quickly sparked, games like Call of Duty that became vastly more successful. And at that moment, the US military stopped developing many of the digital games themselves, but they actually started to train military personnel to participate in the games of others. So this is our members of the US Army esports team, and they are trained to play Call of Duty and to recruit other players within Call of Duty to join the military. So that's another step in this, militarization of our culture, of our day-to-day reality. And another step you could say is that then platform organizations like Atlantic Council, that directly advises the Pentagon, hired people like Dave Anthony, the developer of Call of Duty, to advise on military strategy and imaginary scenarios of future forms of warfare and conflict. So we see here like a whole cultural economy developing around or initiated by the military or the military-industrial complex and creating this kind of feedback loop. The Art of Future Warfare is the platform that Dave Anthony and others were advising. It's basically a kind of Atlantic Council think tank that relies on cultural workers, science fiction writers, game developers to speculate on future forms of conflict that the US military can anticipate on. This is, the US of course plays a really, really central role in this economy, but it's certainly not, they're not the only government that develops these kind of cultural strategies. In the case of the French Ministry of Defense, we can think of the so-called Red Team that was founded in 2019, and the Red Team is a group of graphic novel artists, science fiction writers, game designers. Well, you can see the group here. This is an actual picture from the Red Team, the official Red Team website, who do exactly the same thing as what the Atlantic Council was testing some years before. Like, can we anticipate on future forms of conflict, future forms of warfare by relying on the imaginary of artists, And it's the typical, or like a cliche that is often said about artists is, they have this particular sensory, we supposedly have this particular sensorial sense of, of futures that might come, or like futures that are just around the corner. Of course, here the real question is, do science fiction writers and game developers, do they predict future forms of war, or do they imagine future forms of war, and because the military industrial complex starts to anticipate on those wars, they take place? Like, are the wars of the future predicted, or do they happen because they were imagined in the first place? How much of this imagination actually produces the realities that it thinks that it is predicting? Now, the work of the Red Team, largely it's classified, and that's the same for the Art of Future War platform of Atlantic Council. But some of the scenarios have been released. One of them is the P-nation scenario. So this is a projection of an increasingly growing kind of, how shall we say it? It's a description of an increasingly fortified Europe, a Europe that increasingly becomes this exclusive zone of high privileged and high paid forms of citizenship, whereas around Europe an increasingly large nomadic pirate nation is developing, that then begins to sabotage various critical economic lines and transport lines that Europe relies on. It's an interesting description because it kind of describes an alliance that starts to take place between radical leftists that flee Europe, that join the pirate nation that partially exists out of resistance militia, but also undocumented migrants that have nowhere else to go but to the pirate nation. It's meant as a description of, that's a future danger. From a progressive point of view, you could think, I'm on the side of the pirate nation, of the P nation. But so, the imaginary of the military industrial complex in this case, that is meant as a threat, for some can also be considered as a position of empowerment, of something that could have a potential. It's a future that could have also emancipatory or transformative potentials. What is important to note, though, is that the way that members of the pirate nation are being represented, there's this heavy Orientalist imaginary that is merged with a kind of cyberpunk visual aesthetics. I was a bit shocked to encounter some of the cultural work that was being done here. This is a drawing by François Schuiten, and maybe some of you know the work that he has done together with Peters. I mean, they're really some of the best avant-garde graphic novel artists of the past 30, 40 years. And I was really quite shocked, actually, to find them actively working to fortify French imperial imaginaries of how to control not only the fringes, increasingly violent fringes of Europe, as a result of Europe's own exclusionary politics, but even scenarios that represent, that represent the necessity to impose French imperial control over outer space. So there's a scenario that was developed by the Red Team that imagines a conflict over interplanetary resources, the mining of asteroids, the mining of critical minerals on the moon, in which a battle ensues with an enemy that is known as the Republic of the Circle. This is its symbol. That essentially is a kind of composite enemy. Like it's somehow partially Chinese People's Republic, partially Iran, partially the partial Russian Federation, as often happens. Like in a lot of militainment, you will see that the enemy is not literally the Russian Federation, but this country that is almost named like it, and these people that almost behave like it. And in the best scenarios, from the imperial perspective, they include cultural elements or cultural signifiers that represent multiple enemies at once, as is the case in this, Chinese, Iranian, Russian enemy that is trying to monopolize critical resources for the maintenance of French, intergalactic hegemony. And of course, it builds, on actual fears of the present when it comes to, the future of European hegemony, French hegemony. How serious this is taken, I don't know how serious. This is from France 24. Why Macron is reading sci-fi thrillers to prepare for the wars of the future. These sci-fi thrillers literally are the scenarios produced by the Red Team, and supposedly Macron has a direct line to consult members of the Red Team on decisions relating to foreign policy when it comes to anticipating future forms of conflict. Of course, is this part of the propaganda effort when it comes, creating a kind of mysterious atmosphere around the Red Team? It certainly signifies that art and culture are being taken extremely seriously here in understanding the future, anticipating the future, predicting the future, and I would say, creating future conflicts, by staging them, by imagining them, by preparing for them. We are also partially creating them. Maybe a last example, because we moved now from the realm of game development to more, science fiction and graphic novel. The last aspect of cultural practice in this, attempt to militarize day-to-day reality that I would want to touch upon is immersive theater. This is an aerial view of the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert. It's a very, very expansive military training site. I would say immersive theater that reconstructs, that has really vast landscapes of reconstructed towns from Afghanistan, from Iraq, today also from the Russian Federation, where military personnel is trained, rehearses forms of present and future conflict. It's a very, I call it more than a training environment because there are a lot of dramaturgs and script writers involved. At the time that this site was used to train for the Afghan and Iraq wars, Afghan Americans and Iraqi Americans were actually paid to live inside the model for 20 days a month. And each day they would receive a script that designated for them a specific role without knowing exactly what scripts their neighbors would have received or what scripts the soldiers received, to create this, multi-scenario setting in which various improvised forms of conflict could emerge that neither of the participants could anticipate on exactly. And this, these are quite complex dramaturgical and script-conscious endeavors that I wouldn't just call military training. I would really call these forms of immersive theater that, similar to the games, try to prepare, shape a mentality, prepare a mindset in which distinguishing between our present life and life at war becomes increasingly minimal. This is a map of the current training modules. Donovia is basically the composite enemy of the Russian Federation. Atropia is Ukraine. And this scenario was introduced well before the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. And that again, puts this question: do the conflicts that we're currently witnessing take place as a result of geopolitical tensions, or partially as a result of rehearsal, as a result of pre-scripted engagements and preparations that sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily produce the conflicts that they are preparing for? Here's some more impressions from these training environments. Here again, this is, the level of detail, the level of investment, the scale of this immersive theater module is exceptional and very specific to the US, but the US has pioneered these techniques of immersive theater, but it's certainly not exclusive to it. So for example, this is the equivalent in Europe, one of the equivalents in Europe, the German Army's Combat Training Center in Schnoggersburg. There are not people living inside the module, so these are more prepared, the immersive model, the immersive theater scenarios that take place here are more, they take place in very specific periods of time. There's not this ongoing inhabitation, so it's slightly less expansive in that sense. But it follows, and it has learned from and was developed through advisors of the US military. So it's very much a kind of continuation of this work. There's differences as well, because the US training modules, they represent countries that the US either considers as places to invade or to control in one form or another, whereas Schnoggersburg is very clearly itself. Like, this is very clearly the most functionalist representation of Germany imaginable. So its imaginary is, is that it will be occupied. It rehearses that it will be occupied by others, and it rehearses that American allies will then come to work or advise German military to fight in this more kind of proxy type setting against the foreign invader. The more dark version of the immersive theater, the darkest version of the immersive theater model is most probably the IDF Urban Warfare Training Center that was gifted by the US, modeled after the Mojave Desert and NTC Training Center. It's nicknamed Mini Gaza, and of course here the cynicism is that it is, literally built in occupied Palestine next to Gaza to rehearse the invasion and further occupation and genocide in Gaza. It's different than Schnoggersburg. It's closer to the level of aesthetic detail that the US module engages. So there's even artists employed to make graffiti and slogans on behalf of a staged resistance within Mini Gaza, as you can see here. It's IOF soldiers themselves, militants themselves, that perform the role of the enemy combatant. So there's really this attempt to, in a way, control not just the built environment, not just the population, but even control the way that the resistance of the population behaves and their aesthetic expressions. So it's really this attempt of colonization, not just of land, but the colonization even of the physical appearance and performativity of your opponent. So this maybe as a set of examples of the role art and culture plays in propagating realities from a perspective of dominant regimes of power, whether that is the US empire, whether that is the French government, whether that is the Israeli occupation. And I think that these forms of propaganda culture, propaganda art. What they show is what they prove, what they give evidence of, is what I was trying to argue before. Propaganda is not just about sending a message. Propaganda is about creating the environments in which one reality can be entirely replaced by another. Now, my work is partially focused on researching those world-making efforts by dominant regimes of power, but another part of my work is also invested in working together with popular mass movements and progressive political parties and unions to imagine, script, rehearse, stage what I call genopoiesis. So not genocide, but the genopoiesis as a collective effort of creating conditions in which life and the meaningful reproduction and of life and the meaningful maintenance of collective life remains possible, or at least imaginable. We could also call it the politics of regeneration. And the angle that I will take to discuss some of my own projects, some of my own artistic projects, will be that of immersion. So let's say, they have their training camps, they have their, immersive forms of art and culture to immerse you in the types of realities they want to create. In some way, I try to propose something slightly similar. I would suggest to keep that in mind as I share with you some of these examples. First example is a project that I started in 2012. It's ongoing. It's called the New World Summit. It's an artistic and political organization that creates alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. This was the first of such parliaments, temporary structures of political assembly that we created in the Sophiensäle in Berlin for the 7th Berlin Biennial. And all the flags that you see surrounded in the parliament, organized by color, belong to organizations that are at present placed on designated lists of terrorist organizations. So if you're labeled as a terrorist, that means your bank account is frozen, your passport is revoked, a travel ban is installed. You are essentially declared stateless. And there's an extreme form of double violence in that, or double negation in that, if you take into consideration that many organizations on these lists are already stateless peoples. So just in the group of people that you saw assembled in the previous image, there's John Andoni Leque from the Basque Independence Movement, there's Fadil Yildirim of the Kurdish women's movement, there's Moussa Ag Asserit of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad. It's a Kel Tamashek Tuareg-led nomadic coalition in the Sahara-Sahel region. These are all representatives of political organizations that are already stateless people who are then, through terrorist labeling, declared stateless again. What we tried to do was, and I'll just share with you a few examples of these alternative parliaments we created. The previous one was Berlin, this is Brussels. After this will be Utrecht, Oslo, and Rojava, which is the autonomous Kurdish region in West Kurdistan, northern Syria. What we were trying to do for these parliaments, and when I say we, I refer to the architects and designers and progressive diplomats that I work with to develop these spaces and environments, was in a way to create these infrastructures to recompose who or what constitutes us in the us versus them dichotomy that was propagated in the war on terror, that created this, this label of the terrorist in the first place. And the kind of core propaganda narrative the core idea behind the us versus them narrative is us constitutes what? The liberal, enlightened, Western, democratic, order, and them is then a barbaric, degenerate, terrorist East that is somehow acts from an innate hatred of democracy. Now, of course, we have gathered about 35 different stateless nations, blacklisted organizations since we started our work. I mean, most of these organizations come from long histories of anti-colonial liberational struggle. Many of their political platforms demand fundamental redistribution of wealth, land redistribution. I mean, profound democratic demands, far too democratic for democracy for liberal democracy to bear. And here, so essentially, we see that, that the war on terror also represents a fundamental conflict between different conflicting conceptions of what democracy entails materially, politically. And that gave us an angle to engage with our own propaganda operation, you could say, recomposing us, creating alliances between members of politicized members of civil society that opposed the illegal wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya, and groups prosecuted through that war to, in a way, disassociate ourselves from what we consider the real terrorism, namely these forms of state terrorism, mass interventions. At least 1 million people were killed throughout the war, the first phase of the period of the war on terror, and that's direct deaths, not indirect deaths, which estimation is vastly higher. That was the kind of operation that we were trying to engage with, recompose, create these parliaments of immersion to recompose who constitutes us in the us versus them divide. Now, that also changed, the working on this project for several years also changed our own roles. We began as a kind of hosts of these gatherings. At some moment we were invited by the autonomous government of Rojava in West Kurdistan, northern Syria, after they declared independence from the Assad regime in 2015. They introduced there a political model they referred to as stateless democracy or democratic confederalism, women-led decentralized form of self-governance. And they embrace statelessness, not as a position of victimization, but as the precondition for an emancipatory practice of democracy, the liberation of democracy from the state, in their words. And they commissioned us to develop a parliament with them based on the, Kurdish movement had participated in our projects from the start, and at some moment said, okay, you are a parliament for the stateless, we are a stateless democracy. We want to work with you to actually create an infrastructure, a permanent infrastructure that represents these values and ideas. And that's how this parliament came into being in Derek. It's the first city that you enter when you come to Rojava, when you cross the Tigris from South Kurdistan. That is the northern part of Iraq. It was inaugurated in 2018. And I think it's important just to share this process of, if we think of art and culture in the context of an emancipatory model of propaganda, the aim is to propagate an imaginary, but also for that imaginary to take material hold. If we only imagine futures that might be possible, but we never create the material conditions for them to realize, then we just create the kind of poisonous utopias, where continuously we hear that another world is possible, but we get no tools to actually create them. And for me, this was an extremely important process in my work, because it's one of the rare moments where, over a long period of time, there was this moment where artistic imaginary, political imaginary joined and found this material common basis in the form of the public parliament. That was an example of an artwork in the form of a parliament. In this case, the parliament was the training module to train for a radical practice of democracy, you could say. Second example would be the artwork as a training camp. Training for the Future is an organization that I founded with Florian Malzacher in 2018. And it was a kind of direct response to the frustration of the various highly effective, secretive think tanks, academies, cloisters in southern Italy, where Steve Bannon with Meloni was training a next generation of neo-fascist leaders. Like, how is it that they, and when I say they, I mean they as in the far-right political opponents, how is it that they are always out organizing us? Like, how are they preparing for the next crisis to introduce their scenarios and imaginaries, and they have them ready, and we're just sitting and waiting for the worst to come. Like, where are our training camps? And that's essentially where Training for the Future came from as an idea. a utopian training camp where for periods of 1 week we create faculties of, of art activists, but also of political organizers and political campaigners, of abortion rights activists, of all the people that we need, both in terms of radical imaginary, but also radical tools of political action and organization, to not just think of alternative futures, but also materially realize them. It's training modules that take place for, as I said, for periods of about a week. This was the first in the industrial ruins of the Ruhr area in Bochum in Germany, where we trained about 600 participants with a faculty of 25 trainers. And of course, as in its terminology, it sounds very disciplinary, which it is in some sense. You have a trainer, you have a trainee, there's a very clear hierarchy. But our trainers are also trainees in the trainings of other trainers. And a good training means that you share a tool with a trainee that at the end of a good training is a trainer in their own right, that has a tool that they can bring to their own communities, to their own political organizations and movements. So there's a redistributive element to this seemingly disciplinary relationship that is, very dynamic and actually extremely productive, at least in our experience. We were challenged, of course, particularly in the period of the pandemic, because these physical gatherings and these physical trainings are extremely important. The previous images that you saw was a swarm technique training when it comes to protest choreographies, which is a very beautiful, very powerful tool that I still use a lot in my own organizing work. Because I am an organizer of the Training for the Future camp, but I'm also a trainee in every training that I help to organize, of course. In the period of the pandemic, we were challenged when it came to the physical capability of gathering, so we organized a decentralized training where trainers organized trainings across the world in their own community without traveling to a centralized place within the regulations that were possible at that moment in that particular location. So some places allowed still for extreme intimacy, some, all took place in the public space in order to guarantee the safety of others. But we insisted on, especially at that moment of crisis, one of those, crisis moments that could also have been used, and in some cases was used, to introduce more progressive politics rather than further securitization or smart city architectures to, further and even more intimately extract bodily data from you under the name of, health security or biohealth or something along those lines. It was extremely critical that we also found our own conditions to continue this training work. The last intensive training camp that we organized was in 2022 under the title "We Demand a Million More Years." It's the last one that I will share with you when it comes to the training camps, but we felt it was an important one because it relates also to our desire to link very concrete political trainings in political organizing techniques and models of alternative self-governance and policy work and you name it, with the insistence on radical imagination. So, political reality will always tell us you can only ask for a better world for my children and the children of my children. Like if I hear one more politician say it, like I want to, shoot them together with Elon Musk. So. Because there's this profound imaginative poverty in such a sentence. Like if we think of the profound and deep earth memories that carry us, even the profound and deep earth memories that underlie our fossil fueled economies, like literally the fossils are fossil fuels, the aggregated bodies of plants and animals that shape the base of kerosene, of oil, of gas. We are carried by this earth memory of millions of years in the making. And then our political demands would have to be reduced to this extremely limited and, how shall we say it, species exclusive perspective of politics. So I want to share that last example of the training and this, very militant and simultaneously imaginative slogan, because it wants to open the space in which political action is possible in a multi-generational sense. Third example from the artwork as Parliament, as an immersive training module, the artwork as training camp, as an immersive training module, is the artwork as a collective action lawsuit. It's a project that failed, but I still think it's important to talk about it because I think its core argument stands. It's a work that I initiated with a human rights lawyer, Jan Vermon. It's a collective action lawsuit that we organized against Facebook. At the time, it was still called Facebook, then it became Meta. This was part of the reason why our court case also, why our court case failed. And what we essentially argued as the basis of this lawsuit was that Facebook has such a disproportionate, with 3 billion active users still today, has such a disproportionate impact on our common reality, on our public interests, that it is not responsible to leave it in the hand of private ownership. To leave such a powerful infrastructure that is so influential in our day-to-day lives without any form of democratic control or democratic checks and balances. And even Amnesty International at the time said, Facebook, when you sign the terms and conditions, it would be like signing the terms and conditions for using the street to go to work. Like, is this a choice? Which also allowed us to argue, these signing of terms and conditions is essentially signing into forced labor. You have no other ways. So many people are dependent on this platform for communication purposes, but also for work purposes. At that moment, you can no longer argue that signing it is a choice. It would be the same choice as someone in conditions of forced labor. It allowed us to make an argument that Facebook, essentially, its ownership model infringes on the right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination is often taken in a very kind of limited sense as the right to your own state. But it is essentially, in the UN Human Rights Charter, the right to govern your own resources. And here, of course, data is the core resource. We are data workers for Facebook. We build it. Its capital, the data it acquires and sells to third parties, is our work. We worked for it, but we were never paid for it. And we demand to own it. This is the core argument of our lawsuit. We want Facebook to be recognized as a public domain, as a collectivized infrastructure under the use and collective governance of its 3 billion active users. And our strategy was to create pre-trials, like you see here, so these immersive court setups, in which Jan Vermon introduced his plea to a public, and we invite the public to become co-claimants in the lawsuit, which we would then file at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva as the only political body that can act at the scale of Facebook and would be able to create precedent which could then be applied through national courts against the corporation, and which could serve as a model to then apply to other trillion-dollar companies as well. So the same, if we would succeed in the lawsuit against Facebook, we could succeed potentially in a lawsuit against Amazon, against Apple, for which very similar core arguments could be made, like Apple innovations were all based on publicly funded university research. We already paid for it, there's no innovation that under the argument of private ownership or some kind of corporate genius should be considered as something that is not, doesn't belong to the public domain. They emerged from the public domain in the first place. The problem, of course, was that we chose for a kind of slow, multi-year campaign, building tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of co-claimants that would join the lawsuit. But in the meantime, Facebook became Meta. People had signed in for a lawsuit against one entity. That entity was continuously changing in its actual form. Our descriptions were no longer correct. We would have to go back to tens of thousands of co-claimants to revisit So we made a mistake because we chose for a strategy of a multi-year campaign, also to try to change the culture in which corporations hide behind the idea of private property. We wanted to reveal these forms of private property as collective or as public property in the first place, but we were heavily outpaced. But we are resuming the law case through different strategies, but it's also important to name strategic failures and misconsiderations as well. It did lead to another project in parallel, from the artwork as collective action lawsuit to the artwork as a court in and of itself, to another art and legal project that I initiated with human rights lawyer Rada de Souza, the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. This is a more than human tribunal in which we organize public hearings against states and corporations for climate crimes, crimes of the past, crimes of the present, but also crimes against the possibility of a future. We work based on a legal foundation called the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021 that calls for an absolute equality between past, present, and future, meaning that fossil fuel companies that are currently committing vast ecocide against unborn humans, plants, and animals of the future under our law are equally responsible for their crimes against the future as they would be for crimes of the past, and their accountability in the present. We've organized public hearings in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, in Gwangju in South Korea, and London in the UK, against national governments, but also against transnational companies like ING Group, Airbus, Unilever, all registered in the Netherlands. But all of the crimes that we have prosecuted, the witnesses that we have called upon, are all witnesses from the Global South. And here we see that the legal system, the law, and particularly bilateral trade agreements are continuously used to outsource crimes to the Global South. So things that are under legal framework of the Netherlands would be illegal when it comes to crimes against indigenous communities in Brazil, for example, and the disappearances of thousands of activists trying to stop the killing of indigenous communities, as well as the destruction of natural habitats of ecosystems. That would be illegal under the Dutch law, but through bilateral trade agreements, it essentially legalizes, outsources this legal reality to somewhere else here. And we try to bring that somewhere else here back into the court cases, in this case, in the Netherlands. So our courts operate as courts, judges, public prosecutors, witnesses. We call upon the accused. The public acts as public jury. They have the responsibility to enact the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. The court itself is built from evidence of climate crimes. Again, we try to bring this earth memory as a presence into the court, as a witnessing presence, and create a sense of bodily intimacy to this, this earth memory that carries us, that we are carried by. Fossils like the ammonite fossil were witnesses of the 5th mass extinction 66 million years ago. We are currently witnessing the 6th mass extinction. They are fossils. We are fossils in the making. There's vastly more that connects us as earth workers across the human and non-human world than with the fossil fuel terror that we are both subjected to from very different time perspectives. Here, impressions of the court in Gwangju, and you will notice the presence of these signs that depict animals across the court. These are all animals that have been made extinct from the period of colonization onwards. That is a core aspect of the evidence that climate catastrophe is a colonial catastrophe. The first mass extinctions of plants and animals begin 500 years ago. They are accelerated, of course, in the Industrial Revolution, but it is important to understand that the moment in which the colonial proprietary perspective of the world becomes manifest, this is the world, living worlds are turned into property. This is the moment in which these first, the foundation of climate crimes that continue to work up until the present and the future becomes manifest. And the words that you see in all of these posters is always the same word. It's the word comrade. but in different languages, sometimes languages that are themselves threatened with extinction or already made extinct. It shows that there is a direct relationship between the extinction of ecosystems and the extinction of the cultures, human cultures that thrive as part of and with these ecosystems. And the use of the word comrade is important because it politicizes ecological relationships. It makes clear that human relations to ecosystems should not be one of mere preservation. It is not our responsibility to preserve or protect nature. The point is to work in a comradely relationship across our ecosystem, across the human and non-human world, for a meaningful, livable biosphere for all, in the face of a criminal fossil elite, essentially, that is making these conditions of livability impossible. That brings me to maybe just a final note, more on the relationship to the title of the talk, because I've reached my 45 minutes, so I want to be respectful of the agreed upon time. The death of Elon Musk and other stories. This is the image that began the dialogue between Donatella and me, and it's a last example of an artwork as a campaign in which I also invite your immersion, if you are willing to partake, which is a campaign that is called Redistribute Extinction, and that is based on the image of the burning superyacht or the burning mega yacht. It calls on a mindset in which we start to think of extinction not as something that happens to us, but as something that we can reclaim and retool and that we can make happen to the things that are making us extinct. So redistribute extinction would mean, to make extinct the things that are calling for our extinction, to make extinct the things that are making us extinct, to make extinction a verb, and to make extinction a verb from that we use from our side to them, rather than as something that is happening to us. And the subject that I found to be most important in this campaign, which is a poster campaign, it's a billboard campaign, it's a very, actually traditional material campaign in public space, actually. The main subject of it is the superyacht. And I think the superyacht is a great subject because I think almost everyone hates superyachts. So it builds on a kind of general common hatred of, cruise ships are very much hated, but, people on cruise ships are often also just middle-class people. But on superyachts, you are almost certain that you are targeting the right people. Also, the point is not to target people on the superyachts. The point is to target these floating climate catastrophes. We think of Jeff Bezos' superyacht, Kourou. I think it puts out 7,000 tons of carbon a year. It's like the equivalent of 7,000 transatlantic flights. And actually, the point is not even the data, because there's also a risk that whenever we talk about the problems of data centers and the use of waters, and then we always use these comparative devices, like this is as much as the entire city of Lisbon in a year, or something like this. And at some moment, all of these comparisons, they don't really matter anymore, because we just know that this is not sustainable. Like that the presence of these kind of infrastructures is not sustainable. But what I find very important in the campaign, in our campaign in which we are trying to, propagate for the shift to start seeing, not burning superyachts as a crime, but the superyacht as the crime, where we try to reverse this extinction narrative and fundamentally and culturally reject and in some way, like with an exorcism, that you exorcise the principle of private property as the most important value above all other values. It's also to find an image of relief, of liberation, of victory, of beauty in the cultural practice of making extinct the things that are trying to make us extinct. And often when we work in the campaign, there's this standard question or response, like, yeah, but shouldn't we recycle the mega yachts? Shouldn't we dismantle them through policy? Like, isn't burning mega yachts itself a climate crime? Like, isn't it itself a climate catastrophe? And that's really, like, apart from the fact that, you know, the carbon cost of burning the mega yacht is nothing compared to allowing it to continue to exist. But there's something more important than that, and that is that it's about the cultural practice. It's about the collective exorcism. It's about the pure joy and the profound beauty and the sense of victory that every burning, drowning mega yacht brings to all of us. You know, and even to people who will say things like, you know, I wouldn't throw the Molotov cocktail myself. No, I reject, of course, violence. I would never use violence. But, and this but is very important, because the moment someone says but, it means that a normative reality, the reality in which normally we say, you know, don't burn the boat, changes. That there's a more deeper underlying belief that takes hold, an underlying truth that takes hold. And that relies to this more fundamental truth of our right to self-determination, our right to defend ourselves collectively against the things that threaten us, and the right to find joy and beauty in the aesthetic practice of burning superyachts. So I brought for you some of the posters. So if for anyone who, you know, who wants to partake to the campaign, I invite you to take one of the artworks, and at the very least, you know, either have them to truly enjoy as an image, as a possibility, as a window into a potential future, but a potential future that, you know, relies on our collective willingness to actually create it, to propagate it, or otherwise just as a point of discussion, like, you know, what is the crime? The superyacht or its destruction? And thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me.
Yeah, I'll take one mic, Jonas. Thank you very much. Yeah, I believe this is a great hand to your talk, which was very fascinating and inspiring. And I took so many notes, actually. And maybe I want to start like asking you something, like starting from the picture that actually put us together, which I believe I saw through Professor Saram last summer, as I was working on my own idea of speculative violence, and I saw this picture of the yacht burning, right? Which, yeah. Yeah, basically, when I saw, so the first time I saw that image, I was really fascinated by the idea that, you know, we are finally pushing forward the imagination to think about other futures and maybe reversing the narrative, as you said. You know, is the crime burning the superyacht or the superyacht itself? You know, so kind of redefine the question, because until now the question has been, you know, violence. You know, allegedly the responsibility is put on the people who eventually would burn the yacht. But going back to the image of the yacht burning, which is the first one I saw, which looked to me like generative AI, right? As I see now that the posters are more like painting, right? It's no longer, you know, a generative image, a synthetic image, correct? Yeah, compared to
the posters I paint myself. Yeah.
Yes, okay. But I want to go back to the image, like the synthetic image that you used, because also as you were speaking and giving us a very good and fascinating overview of the different techniques, such as the immersive scenarios, the red team, speculative fiction, etc., I was wondering what's the role of this new technology that we have today, namely generative AI, because it seems to me that generative AI pushes forward the work that immersive scenarios or the red team or other, you know, the Americans have been doing, the Israelis have been doing, by giving us a sort of prophetic apparatus, by giving us this platform that makes the imagination of the future through images, so through visualization, not only possible, but seamless, you know, by prompting, right? And I myself, I have studied a lot of images that are generated, like synthetic imagery, that portray very problematic futures, very genocidal futures, very futures that are built on erasure, destruction, ethnic cleansing. We have all in mind the Gaza Riviera image, I'm sure. And yet they come under the glossy surface of generative AI, so they pass also through algorithmic or human moderation. So I wonder if you can also reflect a little bit on this idea of like the use of generative AI to push this propaganda further from their side. So when I say there, I mean suprematist, racist, genocidal projects, which are now using, it seems to me, quite a lot of generative AI, especially the SLOP part of it. And again, I'm thinking about, Trump, but not only Trump, like a lot of suprematist movement also in Europe are using it. So it seems to me that there is now the problem of generative AI that we should also engage with. And something that I was trying to suggest in the beginning was that it seems to me that generative AI introduces a further issue, which is that because the visualization is so seamless, it happens in such a seamless way, then it kind of subsumes imagination, like reduces imagination to just visuals, which is for me very problematic because erases the field of imagination, which is much broader than just the field of the visuals, right? So I wonder if you can elaborate on this. And the second thing also I want to raise is the speculative work. Because, you know, speculative is also something that now finance is very much pushing forward. Anthropologist Padurai has a wonderful definition of, he calls it dream work, you know, the work of speculation. Dream plus work, because there is a component of dreaming, imagining something, but there is also a component of working, you know, which financial capital has taken in a very literal way, you know, so it seems to me that they have also taken over that domain, the domain of speculation. And the third point I want to raise is about the tribunals. Okay, so I love the work you did with the tribunals, the hearings, but also now I want to play the devil's advocate. Don't you think that facing this people, this culture of impunity, today represented by people like Benjamin Netanyahu, who has a warrant on his head by the ICC, Trump himself who goes to a country, Venezuela, and sees the president. I mean, this is really a culture of impunity. So meanwhile, you are using a device that really builds around you know, factuality, evidence. So how do we deal with this culture of impunity? Because it seems to me that the tribunal does no longer work, unfortunately. Sorry for the many...
No, these are all extremely good questions. Yes, I remember that I remember a performance that you did in which you talked specifically about the AI-generated images of the Trump Riviera in occupied Palestine, and you made a very important point with regards to the way that these images, in a way, hide the violence necessary to produce them. That their seamlessness and their kind of like seeming, you know, I don't know, pleasant consumerist paradise-like environment hides, you know, the extreme form of exterminative violence necessary to create them. And I thought it was such a, on one hand, it touches on the way that many digital devices, not just generative AI, are used by, you know, like libertarian techno-feudal forces. Like I think of the Mars colonies that are projected by SpaceX under Elon Musk, and you see this fantastic biodomes and the greenification of Mars, but you don't see, you know, the world that has been living biosphere that has been burned and plundered in order to create this market opportunity for Martian terraforming. But you also don't see the enormous amount, the sacrifice of the proletarians that were first sent to Mars to create the conditions for the 0.1% of Earth elite to then go, you know, once the biosphere is created. And the same counts for Peter Thiel's Seasteading Institute, you know, like the drowned world on which some kind of like mega yacht city floats, and the image is somehow extremely evocative and is easy to, because it uses these science fiction tropes that are so familiar and somehow comforting, that it's easy to project yourself into that world. But actually, that image tells you that you are dead. Like for that image to exist, you are dead and buried. Like the global majority is dead and buried. And that counts the same for the techniques with which these images are made. Because you talked about the Riviera and how the Trump Riviera and how that hides its extreme violence. It simultaneously hides, you know, the endless fields of data centers and clean waters that are being extracted, you know, to produce some next-gen Trump meme coin depicting him as Jesus Christ, you know? Like, this is really the banality of extinction, that the reason of our extinction is, you know, endless, weird, like shrimp Jesus videos tormenting the internet that no one actually watches anymore. You know, like, this is what will consume the last drop of drinking water on our Earth. So there's these two elements in which AI hides within its the hiding in the images itself that it produces, but it's also the hiding of its means of production. So between what we see and how it is produced, there's this fundamental disjunction. And I think the work of critical art is actually to create conditions in which how we make images, how we celebrate them, where, you know, the production of an image and what an image represents exists in the same plane. And that's why I love burning superyachts, because building superyachts, the action that is required to make the image and the image are the same thing. Like, we understand this, that the relationship is deep and meaningful, material and collective. So, I mean, in this case, I use it more as a metaphor in our conversation. But, when it comes to the use of generative AI for tactical reasons, I would say, you know, all means available to us when necessary are legitimate. So when it came to you know, creating a series of videos in which, amongst others, Jeff Bezos' superyacht is being targeted, to use the weapons of your enemy against your enemy is, of course, when you are in a position of less power, is of course entirely legitimate. So I have a fundamental objection against AI, what it stands for and how it is produced. But of course, whenever it's tactically opportune, I will use it. And I think it's entirely legitimate that we use it from a progressive point of politics as well, and we don't leave that, you know, as a territory only for the neo-fascist imaginary. And so I think that also touched on your second question, this question of what it does to our, how it relates to our imagination and the imagination we work for. In terms of speculative work and finance, I'm not entirely sure how to answer to the question, in the sense of, it's true, you know, speculation, you know, as maybe an imaginative cultural practice or tool has been hijacked, incorporated, like, you know, a lot of avant-garde theory has been incorporated by dominant regimes of power, like Vladislav Surkov, that is a dramaturg that advises Vladimir Putin and developed, you know, created the scenography for his strategy of asymmetrical warfare. Steve Bannon was a filmmaker who became the main Trump ideologue and the person who ran his campaign. They're all people who very well understand avant-garde culture and tactics and applied them for the worst imaginable purposes. But, you know, that doesn't stop us from having to continue to claim and reclaim and make meaningful those strategies for other means. I think this is just a struggle over means. It's a struggle over reality production. And at some moments, you know, you and your opponent will try to use similar tactics. Like, you know, you can watch the White House Gov X account and the absolute terrifying AI-generated videos that they produce. And you can watch, you know, the Iranian embassy's Lego persiflage of the Epstein White House. It's the same techniques that are contested, radically contested for different political ends, and that's the world we live in. It's a propaganda struggle. And the last point, in relationship to the law and tribunals and the culture of impunity, you are, of course, absolutely right. Like, I think all of us who have had any vague remaining belief or hope for the notion of international law after Palestine, doesn't no longer hold. But that creates even more necessary conditions to reimagine or insist on what justice is, could be, should be, to enact the popular institutions that can carry a future beyond these extremely corrupted and complicit institutions. I think it's a similar question. The question is a struggle over our institutions as they exist and as we need to bring them into being. So I think of it more as a fight and less as, you know, do they work, do they not work? Obviously they don't work, but we can't let go, and simultaneously we can't rely on them only. So for example, we fund the creation of evidence materials by witnesses in the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. They also use those in actual legal cases. We don't deny that there is a role that existing courts play, but we also know, and Rada de Souza as a lawyer knows, they're just not enough. Like, they won't bring us the world that international human rights or something seems to promise. For that, we will simultaneously and in parallel need to build different institutions of our own.
Okay, I want to open the floor. Also, I'm sure there are people who want to ask questions to Jonas. Yes?
Mr. Staal, thank you for your talk. My name is Lena. I'm a communications major, and I'm from Frankfurt, Germany. I have a question to you regarding your projects and initiatives. It's a little bit shorter than Professor Della Ratta's, but yeah, maybe you have something to say to that. It's regarding especially the Training for the Future project. You mentioned smart cities, and I have the question that smart cities are often framed as progressive, green, sustainable, and other nice sustainable words that you can find. But we've also recently seen, especially in the recent past, how these smart cities introduce a new wave of displacement, if I can call it that. And how can projects like Training for the Future and these kind of initiatives help people to resist and intervene in these processes of displacement that we've seen now?
We never had a training specifically related to resisting or opposing, you know, Eric Schmidt coming to your town trying to corrupt your local government into basically, you know, for little funds turning your living city or town into a tech experiment. But that would be a really good suggestion, actually. You know, it's very much the kind of trainings that we do, like from how to perform a medical abortion in countries where it's illegal, developing swarm and protest techniques, you know, sabotage and digital counter surveillance. Like, we really have a really great curriculum, and there would absolutely be a place for what you are suggesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe you have to join the faculty.
I'm sorry.
Because it sounds like you have a plan, and you know, and we also have a plan. So you can come with your plan and join our plan. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to put you on the spot in any way.
No, don't.
It's more like I talked to one of my professors about this last semester, and she shared similar insights or similar ideas, I guess, or just the way she was looking at it, that it's hard to act against these processes that we're now seeing in so many big cities, because it's, in simple words, I guess, profit over people in a way. And big corporations are coming in, people are already in, whether it is already housing projects or already marginalized communities that have been marginalized for generations, and now these neighborhoods are being redefined as safe and very nice and good for families, so prices rise and people have to move out, and a lot of people don't even know what to do against this. or how to act against this. So, and so many communities are affected by that. So, yeah, and
yeah, and of course, and it's you know, it's brilliant propaganda. And also when Eric Smith really started to do, you know, in particularly in Canada, I think it was Vancouver, the first really big. It was resisted against in the end, also through a lot of local community organizing. But he really found, you know, the corona pandemic as the perfect moment to pitch it. You know, like a smart city architecture will know someone is incubating the virus even before they can spread it to anywhere else. You know, this is about biosecurity. This is about, so you know, they have this perfect way to use the disaster capitalism, you know, strategy. Like at moments of crisis, it's the moment where you have your plan ready. And I think the key question to us in such a way is, you know, what is the counterpoint of a smart city? What is a regenerative city? Like, what is our plan when it comes to a next pandemic in which we say we're not going to close our schools, but we're going to bring our our schools to the forest, and we don't need a smart city architecture to tell us that we are incubating the virus. We can just bring our life into places that are common places, that are communal places, and that are safe places, because, you know, sitting inside of these closed buildings wasn't a good idea in the first place. So there's another way where we can say, you know, against your smart city stands our regenerative city, and we lobby our politics, we make sure we are members of political parties, of unions, we stand for government when necessary, we do the work that's necessary to have our plans on the table in the same way that they are trying to. But, you know, it's that cultural struggle in the back end. Like, in the end, there's moments where people make decisions and there are an X amount of scenarios on the table, and the question is ours there? And have we put so much pressure on the person making that decision that they essentially have no other choice but to choose for the regenerative city rather than the smart city version? But indeed, you know, developing those strategies, how to have these scenarios ready, how to pressure local governments, like that would be great. I take it very seriously for the next training for the future. How do you call it? Curriculum, actually. It's a really good idea. Yeah.
thank you.
Anyone wants to jump on?
So did you join the pirate country when you went to Kurdistan?
If Rojava was the P nation, that's a really good point, actually. I never thought about that. But in many ways, that you could say that. Because what I guess is the situation in many revolutions, like the one in Rojava in Kurdistan, is that it attracts a lot of internationalists. You know, you had from your kind of like hardcore German Marxists to the Buchin eco-socialists from the US to like some Nordic people who were obsessed with hexagonal housing building because they believed that this redistributed energy and that this was the housing unit for the revolution, and you know, and even someone who claimed to be one of the co-founders of Bitcoin. Like, all of these people were swarming Rojava because the revolution opens an imagination, and everyone who has, you know, held on to their unfruitful imaginations is looking for a place where they might take hold. And that's very much the scenario that the Red Team describes in the way that the P Nation builds this coalition between people of the Global South and disenfranchised young activists and organizers who join them and combined have the material but also technological savviness to really sabotage the, well, projected, you know, continuation of French Empire. So yeah, I never thought about it, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there is some overlap. Yeah, yeah.
I go? Okay. I'm Jens Köhler. I'm teaching archaeology here at John Cabot. And I like very much the symbolism of your burning superyachts. What came to my mind is a slogan of the 1980s, where I believe an Italian author said, what is the criminal value of a bank robbery compared to the foundation of the bank in itself. And this goes very much this way. My question is another one, with these anti-training camps, or as I may call it already, do you see any risk that you do only react on what global leaders and governments are combining?
I mean, I think we have a lot of very, you know, the core of training for the future is training for alternative future scenarios. So our starting point is not training to resist the existing order. Our starting point is training for affirmative collective futures that we desire and want and are sometimes afraid to imagine to some point. So to undo our fear of the future and reclaim the means of production of the future, rather than that the future is something that is just happening to us in its most dystopian, disastrous, ruinous form. But of course, many of members of our faculty are also people who are in actual struggles and will, provide tools that also relate to how to, undermine, sabotage, resist, protect oneself from existing regimes taking hold. But we do try, and that's maybe it comes back to the "We demand a million more years" slogan. We do try to, while we want to face the realities and risks and difficulties of the present, we also want to and recognize those. We also want to keep emphasizing the necessity of, reclaiming and holding on to futures that are our own, and not just, the lesser of evils in our present. Because it's this lesser of evil logic that also generates the conditions for the worst in the end to take hold. Like, you thought voting or campaigning for Macron was going to save you from Le Pen, and in the end, it just contributes to the conditions of. It's completely legitimate to vote for Macron just because you want to stop the worst from happening, but you can't do that without simultaneously building the actual alternative that you want, because otherwise you'll just be stuck with, stopping the worst, but in the end inheriting something even more dire.
Hello, my name is Tanari. I'm from Mongolia, and the word "comrade," right? That struck me because Soviet Union. Hello. So I was wondering, when you use the word "comrade," like, it is kind of propaganda in the way that USSR used the word "comrade" to insinuate that there was no hierarchy, right? That everybody was on the same side, and everybody was friends. But that's not true. So why? Like, wouldn't it be like another form of propaganda too? Or is it like a counter-propaganda thing that I don't really get?
I mean, I would absolutely say that what I do is about making propaganda. But then if you would ask me, I think all art is propaganda to some extent. Like, all art is produced in relationship to existing forms of power and represents certain interests of power, and there's forms of art and culture that make that visible, and there are those that are trying to hide that. I very, very consciously and very how do you say it, publicly show what I am propagating for, and embrace the notion of propaganda as an emancipatory and transformative practice, and not something that is by definition manipulative or oppressive or based on misinformation or manipulation. I think it can also be a liberatory practice, and there's a long history that supports that, from W.E.B. Du Bois' writings on the necessity of black propaganda to propagate the dignity and struggle of black life in the civil rights and black liberation movements, and Donna Haraway made a beautiful plea in Amsterdam for the necessity of multi-species propaganda to propagate stories that are not just told from human perspectives, but across ecosystems, simultaneously told by octopus and human alike. Lucy Lepard had a wonderful, amazing text in the 70s on what she called intimate propaganda. So the idea that the largest scale at which propaganda can operate is on the one-to-one level. it's not mass propaganda that is in the end effective, but really true intimate comradeship and community that can become resilient against changes and dangerous shifts in our society and continue to defend the better. So I don't have, for me, propaganda is not by definition a negative term. And I understand, of course, there's from the historical perspective that you come from, that you carry with you, that comradeship can have a completely different meaning. For me, it stands for the desire of radical equality and the recognition that we stand on the same side of a struggle. And I think comradeship is one of the most politicizing words there is when it comes to relations between people, but also between people and, in our case, and non-human people, non-humans. And I find that the language around animals or non-human animals is often extremely depoliticizing. So it's very much in a kind of protectionist, conservationist. We have to care for nature. We have to, but nature's fierce. Nature gave us our language, like ecosystem. We borrow our language from our non-human animal comrades. Comradeship is what defines or articulates names that we have a common front, like that we have a common struggle, that calls for this principle of radical equality. And yellow is the new red, so we are reconfiguring also languages of the past that also carry with them extremely traumatic histories and profound mistakes.
If you're interested, I can write comrade in traditional Mongolian.
Sorry, you?
If you're interested, I can also write comrade in traditional Mongolian.
Oh yes, please. I think from memory we have it, but it would be.
Damn.
There is about 68 of these paintings, but I'll make sure you get the. Yes, thank you. That's really much appreciated.
Possibly you raised an Italian language problem, where we have camerata and compagno. What is opposed?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same.
I do think she meant comrade.
It's the same in
in former, communist slash Soviet Union, right?
But comrade is companion.
Yes, yes. And anyway, the offer is there, right? To write is.
Thank you.
Actually, speaking of comrades, we are approaching the anniversary for the liberation of Italy from fascism in 2 days. And so I would like you to mention the anti-fascist church project, which you have not talked about in your presentation, because I think it's extremely interesting, not only because of our own interest being like approaching the celebration of the liberation, but also because it speaks to what we were discussing before, which is, an ecosystem that is increasingly defined by filter bubbles in which we only talk to people who are like-minded. Whereas your experiment, if you can share it with us, shows that you actually build also a dialogue with people who have different perspectives, ideologies, who are united, though, against the rise of new fascism. So I wonder if you can share a little bit.
Well, also in the New World Summit, of course, we have many different stateless and blacklisted organizations. Many of them also stand in conflictuous relationships with each other. So it's not as if there's no we seek for to recompose the us in the us versus them narrative, but we cannot assume that this communality is there, and sometimes we do have. We have faced also very serious conflicts within our parliaments, political, ideological conflicts. But very shortly, the Anti-Fascist Church is a project that I initiated with Jan van Heeswijk. She's also an artist, Dutch artist, very foundational for community art practice in the Netherlands from the 90s onwards. And our project is called Anti-Fascist Church. So we work with churches and we organize 12-hour sermons. In which many different groups contribute to a collective sermon. So, someone will start as speaking as an anti-fascist Christian, it will go to an anti-fascist Muslim, an anti-fascist Jew, an anti-fascist socialist, an anti-fascist anarchist, anti-fascist ecologist, anti-fascist medical care, anti-fascist. We try to really build around the notion of anti-fascism, seek for the broadest possible coalition across groups that sometimes very profoundly disagree on many points of view. But with the increased, consolidation of neo-fascist normativity in our society in the Netherlands is certainly the case, and under Maloney here clearly as well. We have to look for the basis of majoritarian politics across groups that might not always, that we might not see eye to eye on every single issue, but with whom we have a common interest, like. With many of my, Christian and Muslim comrades, like what they call God, I call the collective. We both organize our lives based on a non-individualist, non-proprietary collective perspective. We organize our lives around a greater good. And at that moment, it's not so important that you call it God and I call it collective. Like, that foundation is already more that we have in common than with most liberals. So it's also, and I think that for some reason it probably has to do with the secular nature of a lot of progressive politics. Somehow progressives, people believe in emancipatory politics, tend to seek for alliances with liberals, and I think that's a really big strategic mistake, because the fundamental rupture is really about the rejection of individualism and proprietary perspective of the world. And that was also a kind of core argument I was trying to make throughout some of the projects here, and with the superyacht, of course, in particular.
Thank you. That was great. I don't know if there are any questions. Otherwise, I think this is a perfect ending, also because we are approaching Liberation Day. So thank you so much, Jonas, for being with us, and happy Liberation Day to everyone.